Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I'm Lisa with Lisa Boone Designs, and today we're going to be painting over this cabinet. It's actually a two-piece cabinet. It's a large curio cabinet. The top piece is pretty much all glass. What we're going to be doing is we're painting this bottom piece, and my client purchased this off of me, and she wanted it painted in one color. This is the fourth piece that she has of mine. And so we wanted to kind of keep it neutral. Let me know, let's talk all things paint. So we're starting from scratch. This is like painting 101 with DIY paint. If you've never used DIY paint, please be sure to comment on here and let me know. Now, this is what I did to prep. This piece was just basic dirty dust. It wasn't bad. I did have to sand a little bit on the inside here of the doors because they were really badly scratched, and a little bit on that side. I'm going to be painting over the knobs, so I'm just keeping them on there. There were some scratches up here, so I just sanded just a little bit up some of the wood was just splintering and coming up, and then all I did was clean it. So I have in this spray bottle, I have water and a little bit of Blue Dawn. So I just went ahead and used my water bottle and wiped it all down, and just to remove the soap residue. So it's time to paint. And of course, this is a pint-sized jar. I will go ahead and tell you that this was open and I hadn't used it in a bit. And it had a whole bunch of mold on the top. And that happens sometimes when you contaminate the paint, and it's usually the water. Whenever you don't use distilled water in your brush, or if you add a little bit of water to the paint, it will contaminate your paint. And so I just dumped out, because I had barely used this. I just dumped out what was bad, and I'm going to be using Old School. I really think that Old School is an underdog in the DIY paint line. It's actually one of my favorite colors. I used to use it a lot, hadn't used it in a bit. You do not have to sand when you use DIY paint. The only reason that I ever sand is if I have a really bad finish and it's failing, and if I'm going to paint over a failing finish, I'm going to lose my paint. So I will either use my carbide scraper, or I will sand it all down and then start from there. The only other time that I would sand off a finish is if I'm wanting the top to be wood. And I do not like orange finishes myself. So if I'm gonna use a wood look, I use DIY Paint's Dark and Decrepit. I can see my brush strokes. I can see where it's pulling up there. It's pulling up the paint. And if I keep brushing and I keep brushing like you do with latex paint, it will keep pulling up the paint, and I'll never get it totally smooth. I mean, I don't know if you can see what I'm talking about, but this is when you don't paint, you stop. The thicker the paint, the more texture. And if you use the heat gun, when it's really thick, it'll crack. It'll give you a cracking look, which is really cool actually. But when it's dry, and I don't know if it'll pick it up on the camera, you can actually see what I'm talking about, maybe even a little bit better. Okay, there's no rule. If I have time, I like to let the piece alone after I've painted it before I seal it, because when you go to seal it, if you're using wax, for instance, with a sturdy wax brush, when you apply your wax and you hit your paint and you start rubbing it, you could wet distress it because the paint becomes wet with the wax. And also, if you use a brush, or if you put Big Top on, you could distress it if you're too heavy-handed. Water will reactivate it months if it's not sealed. So That's why sometimes I just like to let it sit, especially if it's for a client and I know I'm not in a rush. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and can you see, like, this is actually perfectly distressed. I really like the way that that looks because I am gonna sand this down. And even though I just dried it, whenever I go to paint, I do like to fine mist it. It just makes a difference. And I'm gonna go ahead and lightly, I'm not gonna use too much pressure. And especially with these new brushes, you kind of can't use too much pressure. Typically when I distress, I'm gonna be distressing all of the edges, all like here, because I want, if something is all one color, you will not see the details. There's multiple layers here, so I'm gonna make sure that I sand all of the trim. You will be able to make heads or tails as to what's going on. And see, I painted over the hinges. That's not a problem with DIY paint because there's no latex, there's no plastic. It's not gonna get gummy. It's not gonna mess up your hinges. And if you don't want them painted, you could just get a baby wipe or a rag that's wet and you can wet distress it. I probably will do a little bit of that, and then I also will hit it with some gold. Follow my page. I've linked it in the description, and from there you can access all of my links, my YouTube, my website, Lisa Boone Designs, if you're looking for DIY paint. Every now and then I get super surprised by a piece. This definitely was one of those pieces. Here I thought, this is gonna be so easy. I'm gonna knock this out so quickly. It was a little bit of a nightmare because it just kept bleeding through. And I applied several coats of spray shellac, painted over, still was getting bleed through. So I grabbed my can of shellac and I painted the entire piece 2 coats with shellac, and I still had some bleed through after I repainted it. So you just never know. Clean it really well and see how it goes. Always have shellac on hand so that if you have to cover it up. You could also use DIY Paint's Salvation Solution as a primer before you paint it. My rule of thumb is if my rag comes out dirty, I know it's going to bleed through, and so that's when I will prime it. Otherwise, I don't. I just let it go and I see where I'm at. On the top piece, I went ahead and I primed it before I painted it because I had a feeling it was going to be a problem child, and it was. So I painted this. Now, you know, I did 2 coats of shellac. I saw some bleed through coming through last night, so I left it alone. Sometimes it comes in over time, and I wanted to make sure I got it all done. So I've got my spray shellac this time. I'm just gonna hit the spots that are bleeding through. And so we can see that there's some oil coming through here and also over here. So I'm just gonna hit it really quickly. All right, I am to the point where I'm finally going to add the element that my client wanted. She wanted like a branch and a butterfly to kind of coincide with the piece that I had done before. I remembered that I had this stencil and I did a table for her that had a whole bunch of birds. I decoupaged a whole bunch of birds. So I know she likes birds, and I thought, well, what if I did this and I could still add the butterfly? And what I did was I had a drop of vintage linen at the bottom. I added a drop more. I added a little bit of crinoline and a touch of faded burlap because it's what I had. She wanted it in cream. Use a limited amount of paint on your stencil brush to get a great stencil, and then take a fine brush and paint in all of the negative spots so that it'll look hand painted. I also added some other leaves and just filled it in as I wanted to, and I think it turned out really great. To make this quick, I'm going to be using Sweet Pickins top coat in the satin finish. Sweet Pickins milk paint is extremely durable. It's a scratch resistant top coat. Put one coat, wait 4 hours, put your second coat. Now you can see how it immediately starts darkening up. I did a light touch, I didn't smudge, and I'm pretty happy with that application. Here is the before. And now here is the after. My client loved it. She loved the stencil detail on the bottom, and I added a couple of butterflies, one on the bottom and one on the top, and she loved it. Please sprinkle this, and it helps DIY paint, and it helps all of the retailers as well. So I appreciate you, and I look forward to seeing you guys next week. Okay, ciao.